Welcome to Lesson 1 of Crim 120, Trends in Corrections, where we will talk about the prison boom and the reasons for it. First, I want to go over just a quick definition of corrections. I think when we think about corrections, we tend to immediately go to prison and maybe jail, but it's, of course, a much broader part of the criminal justice system than just that. It is all the various aspects of the pretrial and post-conviction management of individuals accused or convicted of crimes. So that would include, once you've been arrested, you're pretty much in corrections at that point. You go to the court where the court decides whether or not to put you in jail, release you on your own recognizance, release you on some sort of bail amount while you await your trial. And then, of course, once you've been convicted, prison or whatever, probation or whatever your sentence is after that, that is all corrections. And it's important to remember that of the people under correctional supervision, only a small percentage are actually in prisons or even jails. The vast majority are on probation and parole, right? But we'll talk about that later. And this is an important thing to keep in mind, that the goal of corrections is to enhance social order and public safety. So criminal justice generally, and corrections especially, is a highly politicized topic. So politicians, everyone has really strong opinions about corrections, regardless of how much actual knowledge, education, or experience they have on the topic. And what's important is to remember that as much as people disagree on the right and on the left, ultimately we all agree on the goal of corrections, which is to enhance social order and public safety. And so the devil's in the details, and ultimately the disagreements happen over how to do that, how to enhance social order and public safety. But it's important to remember that at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We all want safer communities and justice. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. My goals in all my criminal justice courses, and in particular corrections, where people come in with very hard opinions on all sorts of things, is by the end of the semester, whether you're right wing or whether you're left wing, hopefully you'll be a little less of that when you leave. Hopefully you'll appreciate that it's a lot more complicated than any simple ideological answers might imply, and that both sides make a lot of good points. And so hopefully by the end of this class, you will be in a better position to sort of balance out and consider all points of view and realize this has been going on for thousands of years. Anybody who acts like there's easy answers to this is either lying or a fool. And so hopefully you'll appreciate just how complicated it is, and you'll approach these problems and these issues with a little humility and a little openness to listening to other people. But first, a couple of questions. Has crime in the U.S. been going up or down over the past 25 years? Well, it's actually been going down. And if you ever have questions, a great place to get this information is through the UCR, and that is the Uniform Crime Reports. And the Uniform Crime Reports are maintained by the FBI. It is a voluntary program where law enforcement offices across the country submit their crime data, and they submit a lot of different crime data, but usually what you get in the initial reports, the UCR, is the top crimes, the Index 1 offenses, which are considered the most serious offenses, and that includes violent crimes such as robbery, rape, murder, homicide, aggravated assault, and then, of course, property crimes, which are far more common. Again, when we think about crime, we tend to go straight to, well, sadly, a lot of students go straight to serial killers and whatnot, but we tend to go straight to murder, rape. Those are really, really small slices of the crime problem in America. The vast, vast majority of crimes are property crimes. And so that's also something else to keep in mind. But you can always, if you're writing papers or doing reports or anything, I think the UCR is a great place to go for your data. And you can see they have all these different tables. We're going to go just nationally looking at the crime rates. And here you can see violent crime, murder, rape, And we won't talk about this rape legacy definition. Robbery, aggravated assault. This table gets a little too big for the screen, so it gets hard to scroll over. But if you just look at violent crimes, that's the number of violent crimes, and this is the violent crime rate. And whenever you're talking about, well, really any sort of social trend, such as crime or disease, you always want to use rates rather than the raw numbers. So this would be the number of violent crimes in America in 1999, 1,426,000. So you can see it goes down a little. But of course, if the population goes down, then the violent crime problem is the exact same, right? And so rates are a way of controlling for population. So instead of just going to the raw number of 1.4 million violent crimes, the question is, well, out of the population, what are the actual odds or the risks of being victimized by violent crime? And here you can see that usually these rates are by per 100,000. And so in this case, it is that. And so the violent crime rate is 523 violent crimes for every 100,000 people. And you got to do that because if you were to sit there and compare, say, violent crimes in Chicago to violent crimes in Indianapolis, well, of course, Chicago is going to have more violent crimes, a higher number of violent crimes. They have more than twice as many people. So you'd expect more than twice as many violent crimes, and you'd still have an equivalent violent crime rate. And so you always want to look at rates. And oftentimes you won't see that in the news. In fact, sometimes you'll see people calling it a rate, but they're actually using the raw number, and that is completely incorrect. So anyways, here you can see 1999, the violent crimes and the violent crime rate. We'll just focus on the violent crime rate. 523 violent crimes per 100,000 people. And then you can see year over year, it's gone down. It keeps going down, right? Look at that. It starts in 1999, 523, and look, it just keeps dropping and dropping down to 368. So you can see there was a little bit of an increase here, a little bump in a couple of years, and then it starts dropping back down again. So when you see 19, this is like your lifetime. So during your entire lifetime, every year, year over year, it's gotten safer and safer to live in America. This is like the golden age of safety in America. But yet, when you survey Americans, most Americans think crime is going up. And this holds for property crimes too. But most Americans believe crime is going up. Obviously, that's a function of media. It's a function of, well, that's really it. No, if it bleeds, it leads. There's very few news stories about the crime rate going down every year. Usually it's the news, social media, all these echo chambers. They're all filled with stories of murder and mayhem. And of course, obviously, we still have violent crime, but it has been going down quite a bit. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Is imprisonment rising or falling in America? Well, actually, it's going down. In the last decade, it has gone down about 15%. Our incarceration rate has dropped about 15% between 2008 and 2018. So when I started at UIndy, which was 2007, it had been going up for over 30 years. The incarceration rate had been going up almost every single year in a massive prison boom. And it's only in the past decade, since 2008, where we've seen this drop in incarceration by about 15%. So it's important too to put our incarceration rate into context. So the actual incarceration rate, and you'll see all kinds of numbers. It's always changing, obviously, is one thing. And then the other issue is sometimes incarceration rates will include jail, and sometimes it'll only include prison populations. So in America, if you just look at prison, it's really in the mid 500s per 100,000 people. And then when you include jail, which of course includes people who've been either convicted of misdemeanors or people awaiting trial, it goes up to, really right now it's around 730 per 100,000. And right now being the summer of 2020. And You can see, though, I like this table because it demonstrates not only do we have the highest incarceration rate in the world, we have the highest incarceration rate in the world by a lot. So, especially when we're compared with other Western industrialized countries, right? European countries, Canada, we have a hugely higher incarceration rate. Once you include us with developing countries and non-democratic countries, it's not quite so high, I guess. So you can see here where, again, and look at the difference in these numbers. So again, you're always getting these, this is prisonpolicy.org, and this is the Sentencing Project. And so here, and again, the numbers aren't really the important thing because those are obviously changing all the time. What's important is sort of the relative incarceration rate relative to other countries. And so you can see that below us you have El Salvador. Actually, Belize, which is a very small country in Central America, would be up there with us. But below us, Rwanda. And then again, it's not until you get way down here, substantially lower, that you get into Western industrialized countries. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. If you go into Wikipedia and look at incarceration rates, they have this map and it's color coded by incarceration rate. So the lowest incarceration rate is yellow, and America, the highest one, is dark blue. America's is so much higher than everyone else, we get our own color. So we're the only country that is this. This is basically the United States incarceration rate is dark blue. And then they start with all these other colors of, say, this light blue, and then it gets down. But you can see again that America has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and it is singular in its incarceration rate. But on the upside, the rate has been going down again for the last decade. Importantly, it wasn't always this way. So this is a recent phenomenon. So you can see and it would keep going back for like 100 years in America, the incarceration rate stayed pretty consistent. And this controls for, you've got World War II in here, you've got the Great Depression, you have Vietnam and all the social unrest during that time. You have a lot of major social and economic upheavals, and yet the incarceration rate stays pretty consistent all the way up until roughly 1980, the late 70s, early 80s. And it used to be so consistent that people just thought that that was a natural function of society, that societies always had a consistent an incarceration rate, a consistent sort of punishment system, regardless of the crimes, right? It was based on this interesting Durkheimian philosophy that you just sort of always will have a certain number of people labeled as delinquent or deviant that you will punish. And that all went out the window in the late 70s, early 80s, where suddenly you just see this huge, huge spike in incarceration. And again, you see it here, it sort of peaks in 2008, and then it's been going down, and it goes down even more into 2018, 2019. What's important to remember, too, is that crime has not been going up during that time or even going consistently down. So you can see where drug use specifically, which is not on this chart, but drug use peaked in 1978. So here, if you look at this, drug use sort of starts to increase here in the 60s, and really in the 70s is when people started really cranking it up with their drug use. And it peaks here in 1978. And then it goes down from there on. Meanwhile, though, you see substantial increases in arrests and incarceration and sentencing for drug crimes despite that. Similarly, you see all these property crimes: larceny, burglary, motor vehicle theft. And larceny is basically, like shoplifting and stealing from a property where you're allowed to be. Burglary is stealing from a place after you've trespassed. And so you can see here where the crimes are going up. So there was a pretty steep incline in crime in the 60s, and then into the 70s, and then after that it's been going down. And so again, you can see where the incarceration rate doesn't necessarily align with the crime rates perfectly. And so it's interesting because people generally will argue one of two things. So you see people on the left will say, well, look, this is crazy. The incarceration rate's been going up year after year after year after year, but the crime rate's going down year after year after year. So why are we doing that? Well, on the other hand, you could also say, hey, look, as the incarceration rate's been going up, crime's been going down. So you could say that, well, why are we locking more and more people up even though crime's going down? You could also say, well, because we're locking more and more people up, crime started to go down. So again, as you'll see over the course of this class, every stat that you see can be interpreted multiple ways. And I think it's important to open yourself up to all the different possibilities. So why did this happen? Why, after so many years of basically the same incarceration rate, did we just suddenly see it fly? And again, drug use didn't go up, right? So we know that one of the reasons is, of course, drug arrests, but drug use didn't go up. So what happened here? We're suddenly just out of nowhere, this huge spike in incarceration, to where we have now by far the highest incarceration rate in the world by a lot. So we incarcerate close to 25% of the world's prisoners, right? Almost a quarter of the world's prisoners are in America. So why is that? Well, one was the war on drugs. So the war on drugs started in the late 70s, and every president since then really kept going at it and kept increasing that. And so we had a lot of increased arrests and prosecutions, but there was no real increase in use at the time. Another reason is parole and probation violations. So just, I believe, last year, 30% of prison admissions was for violation of a condition of parole or probation. So a third of people are going to prison not for a new crime, but for a technical violation on an older crime. And we'll talk more about that in Cherning. And then longer sentences. So if you have longer sentences, you don't even need to lock more people up. You're just sort of going to end up accumulating more people just because people are in there for longer periods. And so we started implementing these mandatory minimum sentences that extended a lot of these sentences so that prisoners couldn't get out on parole, they couldn't get out early, and they had longer sentences. And so as that happened, you'd see the prison population increase. The drug war is generally regarded as one of the primary reasons for the big increase in incarceration from the 70s, 80s, really up until just a few years ago when we started to see the drop in incarceration rates. And you can see here, this is a table of incarceration rates by crime type from 1980 to 2001. And so some of the data we'll go over will seem old, but of course, this was the big prison boom. So it is, in some ways, sort of a history lesson in how did we get to where we are now. So you can see the drugs, incarceration by drugs, shot up in the mid 80s. You can see where it was one of the smallest reasons. Back in 1980, you had robbery up here, burglary, murder, sexual assault, and assault, and then down here you had drugs. And it was going along with the trend, kind of slightly increasing. And then around the mid 80s, it just suddenly took off and just really took off. And so one of the reasons, well, there's a couple of reasons. One is the drug war, which was started by Richard Nixon, but really pushed by Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton. And you can see here when Bill Clinton was in office is actually, you see this huge. So it was really George Bush and Bill Clinton were the major sort of drug warrior presidents. Meanwhile, drug use was going down. Drug use actually peaked in 1978, and that's just about all the drugs. So in this table, you can see marijuana, cocaine, and then the legal drugs, alcohol, and tobacco. But here you can see just for cocaine, say, it started to go up and up and up. And then around 1978, it peaked, and then it started to go back down. And what's interesting is we talked about how the incarceration rate and crime kind of are going in opposite directions. As incarceration rate goes up, crime's been going down. So people say, well, stop locking people up. There's no relationship. Other people have said, well, maybe that is the relationship. Maybe because we're locking more people up, crime's going down. That doesn't really hold for the drug arrests and incarcerations, because uh, you can see here where the increase in drugs really didn't happen until the mid 80s, but the drop in drug use had already happened. So we're already seeing this, right? And from 1978, and then this is when suddenly we go crazy and start arresting people. And the same thing would go for marijuana. You can see here where it sort of peaks. There's 1978, spot on, and it immediately starts to go down and down and down and down. And then drug-related incarcerations really start to shoot up here. So the drug war has really borne no relationship to actual prevalence and incidence of drug use of any drugs except crack cocaine. And so in the mid 80s, really America lost its mind about crack cocaine. So crack cocaine hit the scene in the 80s, and it is more addictive than cocaine. So the addictiveness of a drug is affected by a couple of things: the route of administration, uh, and how refined it is. So, for instance, coca leaves, from which you get cocaine, are not entirely nearly as addictive as something like cocaine. They drink it as tea or they chew it in South America. But once you extract and highly refine it, just like processed foods, right, that are more addictive than their whole counterparts if you process and refine out the sugars and the fats and whatnot. But anyways, crack, you smoke. You can't smoke cocaine. You can smoke cocaine all day long and it's not going to get you high. It has to go through a process to be able to be smoked. But the difference between cocaine and crack is when you smoke it, it crosses the blood-brain barrier much quicker than if you snort it, where then it has to be absorbed through your nasal cavity, through your capillaries, then it works its way up. Smoke, it immediately hits and it goes right to your brain. So it's a much faster high, which then also results in a much shorter high and a much faster crash. And so that is what makes drugs more addictive, is if it's a higher high, but also if it's a faster high. And so that's what crack did. So crack would be one of the reasons, but ultimately, if you look at the actual incarceration, the reason why people get incarcerated, and it's hard to get these statistics on the sorts of drugs and what the actual charges were, but actually a lot of people went to prison for marijuana charges. And so there was this big war on drugs. It was waged in the name of crack, for which a lot of people did go to prison, but also you found a lot of people going to prison for all kinds of drugs. Interestingly, too, you see prison drug admissions by race. This is when African Americans became greatly overrepresented in corrections. So you can see here, prior to the mid 80s, blacks, whites, and Hispanics were incarcerated at basically the same rate, right? Hispanics slightly lower, whites slightly higher here. And then again, sort of in the mid to late 80s, it just shoots up for African Americans. And this is largely because of the war on drugs and the war on crack. And so crack cocaine actually in real numbers is used by more white people than by black people. But in terms of percentages, really just urban individuals and poor people tend to use crack cocaine over powdered cocaine because it's way cheaper. Because even though it's more addictive, there's actually a lot less cocaine in crack. To make crack, you would take cocaine and you would just you put it in boiling water. You add baking soda to it and you boil out the water until the baking soda and the cocaine combine and create little rocks that sort of crack, and that's where you get crack. So it's actually a very dilute form of cocaine. So the problem is, though, during the war on drugs and the war on crack specifically, we had really big disparities in the mandatory minimum sentences. So that 5 grams of crack, which is not very much, would get you a mandatory minimum sentence equal to 500 grams of cocaine, which is way more cocaine. It's way more cocaine because it's 100 times more just of the drug, but cocaine is only a tiny portion of crack. Cocaine is cocaine. So it's just a double disparity there. And then so African Americans were picked up at a much higher rate, and they were also then locked up for longer times because of crack cocaine. You can see here, this is arrests, and so the arrests are the same too. So here's white arrests for drugs from 1980, and then here's black arrests, and you can see where it shoots up during the 80s. And so African Americans were being locked up for longer times, and then they also were being arrested at a much higher rate. So when you see these data, you really have only two conclusions you can draw. Either the criminal justice system and the drug laws are operating in what turns into a racist pattern, or African Americans do in fact use drugs at a higher rate, therefore they would be more likely to be arrested and more likely to be incarcerated for drugs, right? Those are really the only two conclusions you can draw. Well, that's a pretty easy question to answer. So the National Institutes of Health, of course, if we can get to it here, they do annual surveys. They do drug use surveys. In fact, you might have done some of these in high school where they ask you about the drugs you've used. Let me see if I can get to the page here. And here is the prevalence, and this is for 1996, which again, that's what we're interested in. This is the midst of the war on drugs, the midst of the prison boom. Prevalence of past drug use in the United States by age, sex, race, ethnicity. And it's through percentages. So here is, let's just go down to marijuana. So marijuana use for 12 to 17-year-olds, about 7% of whites reported using marijuana. The exact same percentage of blacks, 7% of blacks. Slightly lower percentage of Hispanics use marijuana between 12 and 17. And then quite a bit more Native Americans, at 18% reported using marijuana. So at the ages of 12 to 17, whites and blacks use it at the exact same rate. The age of 18 to 25, which is really the peak in drug use for just about every group, this is when people really get their drugs on, right? Is, you can see 14.4% for whites, slightly fewer blacks, smaller percentage of blacks are using marijuana. Again, a smaller percentage of Hispanics, and considerably more Native Americans. So it's not until the third age group then that you see it sort of flip. So 18 to 25, which is in a lot of more, the most people are using any drugs. Whites are using it at a higher rate than blacks. And then it kind of flips to where it's 6.6% for whites, 9.2% for blacks, 3.6% for Hispanics, where it drops considerably. And then it's, the Native American drops in half to 13%. And then 35 plus, this is, drug use crime generally just goes down among every group. After the age of 35, people just age out of this stuff. So about 2% of whites, 3% of blacks. So that's marijuana. So basically it's the same, right? It's the exact same 12 to 17, 18 to 25. It's actually more whites than blacks, and then slightly more blacks than whites, and slightly more blacks than whites. So it's basically the same. Cocaine, which is what, this was the war on drugs, was for cocaine. You can see for the age of 12 to 17, blacks don't even register on here. Whites, it's about 0.5%. You get into 18 to 25, which is the highest rate of drug use. You can see about twice as many whites as blacks are using cocaine, right? So 2.3% compared to 1.1%. And then again, it flips. But again, the overall numbers are still pretty low, 1.3% to 3.1%. So it sort of flips from what it was. And then the older age group, again, people just sort of age out of using it. So again, pretty similar drug use rates for both marijuana and cocaine. And then you get into alcohol. And for alcohol, whites use it at a considerably higher rate than blacks. You can see 20% of whites aged 12 to 17 report using in 1996, 15% of blacks, 18 to 25 when people really start drinking, right? 66% whites, 50% of blacks, 26 to 34, 66% of whites, 56% of blacks, and then 35, 54%. So basically, breaking this down, the use of illicit drug use, and here's any illicit drug use, 9%, slightly higher, slightly lower, whites versus blacks. So it's the same across for all practical purposes. But yet, for arrests, it's significantly more blacks getting arrested. For prison, it's significantly more blacks going to prison, despite those research studies that demonstrate blacks and whites use drugs at the same rate. So it's certainly not differences in drug use. So therefore, then you have a problem with what's going on with arrests and what's going on with prison admissions. So we already talked about prison admissions. The main reason for that is mandatory minimum sentencing, which we'll talk about later, and the disparity for crack versus powder cocaine. So wealthy white people use powder cocaine, poor urban minorities, and also poor whites use crack cocaine. And so the mandatory minimum sentence for 5 grams of crack was equal to what you'd have to have 500 grams of cocaine, right? And so eventually they worked to try to even that out, and they actually raised the amount, raised the sentence for powdered cocaine rather than soften the sentence. So that's a problem, right? So that is a major problem. So one of the reasons that researchers say that this has happened is the nature of drug markets. So that if I am buying drugs in an inner city, which is a lot more non-whites, those tend, certainly in the 80s and 90s, they tended to be open air markets, right? So you could actually spot dudes on the street corner slinging dope. And so you would drive up, get your dope, and drive away. Well, you don't have a whole lot of rights, right? So if you're suspected of carrying drugs, dealing drugs, it's pretty easy for a cop to shake you down, find the drugs on you, and arrest you. Meanwhile, if you're buying powdered cocaine, that is not how you're buying powdered cocaine. So you know your dealer, you go into your dealer's home, or they come into your home, right? You hang out for a little while, you buy your drugs, and then you leave with your drugs. Well, inside a home, you do have a lot of constitutional rights. It is much more difficult for police just to come into your private property than it is if you're standing out in the public space. So one of the reasons is it just was simply easier to arrest people in an open air drug market than it is to arrest people when they're conducting their drug business inside the privacy of their own homes. So that's one of the main reasons that researchers have given for that. Obviously, with the growing concern with current events about systemic racism and whatnot, there's going to be a lot more research on this to try to understand why exactly these differences have occurred. And so, given this problem, blacks are now 6 times more likely to be imprisoned than whites. By the age of 18, 1 in 4 black children will have had a parent in prison, right? And currently, 1 in 9 black children does have a parent in prison. And remember, this is despite the fact that blacks and whites use drugs at the same rate. And it's important to keep in mind, this has not always been the case. This is relatively new. To see blacks 6 times more likely than whites to be in prison is a new thing. So I grabbed these pictures off the internets, and this is Johnny Cash's famous concert in San Quentin from 1969. So there he is in San Quentin, and this is the audience. These are the convicts locked up in San Quentin. That is a largely white crowd in 1969. Flip to today, this sort of random picture I stole off the internets, and that is not a largely white crowd. I mean, granted, this is just one shot of the outside. So this is a new problem. A lot of the problem is based in the war on drugs, and that there has been a clear racial disparity in the way we have arrested and in the way we have imprisoned blacks versus whites for drug offenses. So that said, I want you to think about, well, could legalizing weed, right? Could that be one of the answers? And that certainly seems to be a trend going on. Some states have done it and they are experimenting with it. So I want you to think about 3 arguments in favor of legalizing weed and 3 arguments against legalizing weed. And then, do you think we should legalize it?